There we go. All right, well, this morning I have the great pleasure of getting to talk about one of the wildest stories in the Bible. It's really exciting. But before we get into the story itself and what any of the lessons are, we're going to really quickly just explore some of the historical and cultural backdrop and look at some of the important elements of the narrative. So if we put the timeline up there. Awesome. Okay, first of all, we are here at this big arrow, and way over on this side is where Pastor Andy started off with Adam and Eve and Seth, and then way over here on the other side is the birth of Christ. And so here we are in our stories we've been going through and studying each of the major characters in the Old Testament, and we are just post-exile. So if you remember last week when Kyle preached on Daniel, he touched a little bit about the exile and why people were there in Babylon and taken captive. But basically, leading up to that event, the Lord had repeatedly warned the people through the prophets that their continual idol worship and their treatment of marginalized people within their community was going to eventually cost them their land and their nationhood. And then it did. And they were conquered by Babylon, and their people were taken captive. Well, 70 years later, the Jews were finally allowed to return to their land and begin rebuilding the temple, which was fantastic. But not all of the Jews went back. Remember, this was 70 years, so now by this time, some of them were settled, they were established, they had their families there, their friends, their people connections, and so some of them stayed behind. So the group of Jews that we're going to be learning about today is part of the group that stayed. So right in the middle of all of that stuff is one of the most fascinating and funniest and also darkest narratives in the Bible. This story is oddly moved along through a series of parties, and most of the important parts happen over eating and drinking. And even though it's the only book in the Bible that doesn't mention God directly, it is full of theological takeaways that could teach us about who God is and how he works in our lives, and then what our job of surrender is towards him. And honestly, I kind of like that God works behind the scenes here because it is a much better representation of how you and I move through the world in our relationship with and understanding of God. Have you ever had that thought when you read the Bible where you're like, well, yeah, obviously they can have better faith because they saw things, right? They saw bushes burning and seas parting and signs in the sky. Like, they had all that stuff. And if I had that stuff, I might believe the same way that they believed as well. Well, the absence of that in the book of Esther makes it much more relatable to us. And it's also important to clarify what the book of Esther is not. So it is definitely not a fairy tale. It is not a story of a beautiful orphan girl who gets chosen to be the princess and marries her Prince Charming. Phil Vischer, who is the creator of VeggieTales, has this real gift for being able to take some morally questionable stories in the Bible and boil them down into something that is digestible and appropriate for children. And he did a great job with the VeggieTales version of the Esther story, so if you ever get a chance to go back and watch that, it's really cute. But in its context, Esther is actually very, very dark and showcases some of the worst parts of mankind's sinful nature. So with that, let's get into the story. Chapter 1 opens with King Ahasuerus throwing this multi-day rager for all the important people that he wanted to impress. And the Bible describes the kind of finery that they would set up for these events, and that's where we're going to start in verse 6. There were curtains of fine white and violet linen, held by cords of fine purple linen on silver rings and marble columns, couches of gold and silver on a mosaic floor of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and mineral stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels of various kinds, and the royal wine was plentiful in proportion to the king's bounty. But the drinking was done in according with royal law. There was no reservation. For so the king had given orders to each official in his household that he was to do as each person pleased. Queen Vashti also held a banquet for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, that's a lot of partying, you guys. When the heart of the king was cheerful with wine, he ordered his 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's order delivered by the eunuchs. So the king became very angry, and his wrath burned within him. So what's going on here? Well, the custom was, at these banquets, they were attended by everyone who was invited, both husbands and wives. But once the men were merry with wine, all the wives would leave to go do their own thing, and then a different group of women were brought in for a level of entertainment that was unsuitable for the wives. If we fast forward to the time of Jesus, if you remember the story about Herodias' daughter dancing before King Herod, and he was so pleased to take it by her that he ended up giving her the head of John the Baptist, that is what was going on here. So these kinds of parties were really well known. Verse 8 calls the drinking without restraint, which is the polite Bible way of saying that this was a Diddy after party. The Persians were actually so well known for their excessive partying that the Greeks had jokes about how irresponsible these events were. So that alone would probably explain why Vashti didn't want to be there, but there was actually more. The way the author includes the detail of Ahasuerus asking for her to appear in her crown supports the tradition that what he was asking was for her to appear in only her crown. And Vashti would have known exactly what phase of partying these boys were in and what that would have made her if she showed up there like that. So she replies to the king, hard pass. So the king consults with his advisors, and they come up with this plan to make an example of Vashti in order that word of what she did wouldn't spread throughout the kingdom, and then the wives start getting it in their heads that they can start saying no to their husbands, because could you imagine the pandemonium that would come from that? So they stripped away her title, and they sent her packing. She was no longer queen. I'm so glad you asked. Our boy Ahasuerus sobers up and starts missing his wife. Poor guy. So his advisors come up with another plan. They pitch this idea of rounding up all the beautiful virgins from throughout the kingdom and bringing them into the harem and giving them beauty treatments until they're up to royal standards. And then whomever pleases the king the most from among them gets to be the new queen. So here enters our heroes, Esther and Mordecai. Esther is a Jewish orphan who is being raised by her uncle Mordecai, who's a palace worker. So she's taken to the harem with the other women and begins her training in all the things that the king likes. While she's there, the head eunuch who was over all of these women took a liking to Esther and began to give her all the tools that she was going to need that would put her ahead of the other women. And at the request of her uncle, Esther keeps her ethnicity a secret from everyone, which suggests that there is already a lot of underlying racial prejudice against them in their culture. So after a whole year of beauty treatments and training, each woman had their chance to win over the king. So how did they do that? Well, they did that by way of a special sleepover, so to speak. So they would go into the king's chambers at night, and then in the morning, they would leave and go back to the harem. So this was the furthest thing away from a fairy tale beauty contest. These girls were stripped away from their families against their will And we're faced with the possibility of two fates. Number one, get chosen, but then be married to an insecure, indecisive alcoholic who dehumanizes his own wife and loves excess and splendor and partying and pleasure more than wisdom and protocol. Or don't get chosen, and now you're part of the harem, which is the king's exclusive brothel. So it came to be Esther's turn with the king, and she found favor with him and was chosen to be the queen. Shortly after this happened, Mordecai was working at the palace gate, and he overhears a plot to assassinate the king. So Mordecai, remember he's Esther's uncle, tells Esther about this plot. Esther tells the king's men. They investigate it. They find out that it's true, and the assailants are hanged. So Mordecai has now just saved the king's life. Does the king thank Mordecai? No, he does not. That's so rude. Doesn't even thank him for that.
And then what happened?
Oh, I'm glad you asked, because here's where it gets good. So chapter 3 introduces us to our villain, Haman. He's employed in some capacity by the king, and then he gets promoted over all the other officials there at the palace. And King Ahasuerus makes this mandate that all of the other peons have to bow down and pay respect to Haman every time that he walks by. But Mordecai refuses to do so, and this infuriates Haman. So Mordecai's friends are trying to get him to comply, but he would not. And he cites his Jewish heritage as the reason why he won't comply. So these men tell Haman and the reason why he won't comply. And Haman, instead of punishing Mordecai directly, sees an opportunity to eliminate all of the Jews. Chapter 3, verse 5 and 6. When Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage to him, Haman was filled with rage. But he had decided not to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is certain people dispersed and scattered among all the provinces of your kingdom, and their laws are different from those of all the other people, and they do not observe the king's laws. So it is not in the king's interest to let them remain. If it pleases the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who carry on the king's business to put in the king's treasuries." So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. The king said to Haman, "The silver is yours, and the people also. Do with them as you please." So Haman goes to the king with this plan. He created this narrative about the Jews that made them seem like a threat to the nation in order to justify getting rid of them. And the king, without any investigation of his own, signed the royal order and set the date for the destruction of the Jews, and then sent that decree out to all the land. So then Mordecai learns of this decree and is in absolute anguish. You know, it's one thing when the consequences of your actions just affect you, like in the case with Vashti, but now what Mordecai is looking at is the consequences of his actions are going to affect his entire people. So Mordecai stages a protest at the gate in the Jewish tradition of wailing and wearing sackcloth. So Esther sends a messenger to Mordecai to find out why he is mourning, and that's when she learns about Haman's plan. Mordecai asks Esther to go to the king and plead with him on behalf of their people. But then Esther reminds her uncle that one does not simply just go to the king uninvited. And she hasn't been summoned to him for a hot second, which was actually 30 days. It's a long time. And she reminds him, if I go to him and he's not happy to see me, the punishment for that could be death. So Mordecai's reply to Esther here is the turning point in the story and where we get one of the more commonly quoted passages from the Bible. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, Do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all of the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from the Jews from another place. And you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go and assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens will also fast in the same way, and I will go to the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and did just as Esther had commanded him. Now, Esther has some pretty significant trauma. Remember, she was orphaned. She lived with discrimination. She was kidnapped. She was trafficked. And now add to all of that, she's suddenly been given the weight of having to save her entire people. So her initial response is perfectly in line with somebody who is just in survival mode. Her predecessor had just lost everything by going against the king's orders. So her concerns here were not theoretical. Vashti was proof of concept of what can happen if she takes this risk. But Esther finally surrenders to the call, realizing that her life's purpose is greater than her life's mess.
That's what she said.
No,
And then what happened?
you were supposed to practice your lines. All right, guys, here's where things get absolutely wild. So Esther puts on her very best royal drip because she knows that our boy loves fine things. And she goes to the king. And to her relief, he is so happy to see her and welcomes her in. Then the king asks her, "What would you like?" And instead of pleading her case right then and there, she uses her knowledge of his interests and his character to start to let the favor accumulate. So she invites both he and Haman to a banquet that she has prepared for them. And of course, they love this. So at the banquet, the king asks, "Okay, what would you like? I will give you anything that you desire, even up to half my kingdom." So Esther says, "You know what I want? What I really would like is for you and Haman to come to another party that I prepared for you tomorrow." Because if Esther knows anything about the king, it's that the only thing he likes more than a party is a multi-day party. So now Haman is there at the party with this king, and he leaves and goes home, and he is so happy. He is just on top of the world, right? Everything in his life is going great, and all of his plans are going to work out just fine for him. But on his way home, he passes Mordecai, and it totally ruins his good vibe. So he goes home and he gathers all his family and friends around him, and he's bragging about everything that's going on in his life and how great everything is. And I get invited to these exclusive parties with the king and queen. But Mordecai is living rent-free in his head, and he starts complaining to them about Mordecai. Finally, his wife is like, "Listen, what you need to do is just build some comically huge gallows and hang Mordecai on them tonight, and then tomorrow you can just go to the party with the king and queen and put this whole Mordecai business behind you." So that is exactly what Haman does. He quickly has the gallows constructed, and then he heads to the king's chambers in the middle of the night to request emergency permission to hang Mordecai.
And then what happened?
Good job. But then King Ahasuerus can't sleep. So he calls in the scribes and has them read back to him past events. Now, this is before we all fell asleep to reruns of The Office. So this was basically the king's white noise machine. And as the scribes are recounting the story of Mordecai saving his life, the king suddenly remembers, "Oh my goodness, I never properly thanked Mordecai." And just then, Haman enters the king's chambers to ask for permission to kill Mordecai. But before he has the chance, the king stops him and says, "Hey, before you say what you got to say, let me ask you, what are some ideas for honoring someone really special. And now Haman thinks, oh, obviously, he's talking about me. I'm really special. So he says, oh gosh, king, I would put this man in your royal robes. Yeah, and then, oh, a horse. Your horse. Yeah, we're going to put him on your royal horse. We're going to put a crown on his head. It's going to be so great. And then, you know what would be really cool is if you had one of your top officials lead him around the city and shout to everyone about how great you think this person is. But I don't know. Those are just some ideas. I'm just spitballing here. Well, the king absolutely loved this idea. So then he says to Haman, take quickly the robes and the horses, as you have said, and do so for Mordecai, the Jew who is sitting at the king's gate, and do not fall short of anything you have said. So Haman had to lead Mordecai around in the king's robes, on the king's horse, and shout to everyone who was around about how great the king thought Mordecai was. And then he ran back home with his tail tucked between his legs, only to get insulted by his wife and his friends. But at least for Haman, he has the second banquet with the king and queen to look forward to, right? So at the second banquet, after plenty of drinking, the king asks Esther again, what is it that you're requesting of me? Just tell me, I will give you anything, up to half my kingdom. So Esther knows that it's now or never. This is the moment. So she tells the king, someone has threatened my life and the lives of my people and is going to kill us soon. Well, the king is furious about this news, and he was like, who would dare threaten the life of my queen? And now remember, Haman doesn't know that Esther is Jewish. And he's there at that table. And I like to picture the story in my mind, Haman leaning in close and being like, yeah, Esther, tell us, who is it? So Esther points to Haman and she says, it is him, that wicked enemy, Haman. Well, the king had heard enough. Haman begged Esther to spare his life, but it was too late. And the king has Haman hanged on the gallows that Haman had built for Mordecai. Esther begged the king to reverse the orders against her and her people, and he did. So the king gave the household of Haman over to Esther as a gift, and she gave it to Mordecai. And then you know what happened? Mordecai got Haman's old job. And the entire event was celebrated with feasting and is the origin story of the Jewish festival for Purim. So what are some of the takeaways for us 2,500 years later removed from this story? Well, there are some things that we can actually learn from each one of the characters. So from Vashti, we can learn that sometimes doing the brave thing can cost you absolutely everything. It can cost you your reputation. You know, people may never be interested in the context or in your side of the story. And even all these years later, I've sat through messages on Esther where the point was, oh, you don't want to be a rebellious, disobedient Vashti. So it could cost you your reputation. You may never get to see the fruit of your actions on this side of heaven. You know, everything worked out really well for Esther. Everything worked out really well for Daniel and for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Remember, they wouldn't bow down to the idol, and they got thrown in the fire. And they came out of that and didn't even smell like smoke. But Stephen in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, was stoned to death. And from his martyrdom, we get one of the best overviews of the mission of God in a summary from the Old and New Testament that explains why Jesus came and did what he did. But Stephen doesn't get to know that until he gets to heaven. Although it cost her everything, Vashti's conviction set into motion a carefully orchestrated series of events that saved an entire people group from genocide. From Esther, we can learn that no matter our trauma, no matter our choices, no matter how we have initially responded to challenges, and no matter if up until now you have let fear say no to God's will for your life, our lives serve a higher purpose than just survival. Our past may drive us to seek security and run from calling, but those experiences are exactly the things that position us to do the things that God has called us to do, which are just on the other side of security. God does not cause our suffering, but he is so good that he won't let it be for nothing. From Haman, we can learn to ask, Lord, show me where There's a term in psychology called main character syndrome that causes us to affect how we see ourselves in stories and which characters we relate to glean lessons from. It's definitely worse in Western cultures like ours, where individualism really drives us to only learn from the heroes in the story. And we often teach the book of Esther this way, like, be brave like Esther, or be faithful like Mordecai. But rarely ever do we hear, Lord, show me where I've been like Haman. Lord, show me where I have prejudice and self-promotion and pride. Lord, show me the areas of my heart that are out of alignment with yours. And then be vulnerable enough before the Holy Spirit to listen to what he says and then surrender those things to his will. You know, in the moment, our struggles often look like the backside of a tapestry, just a mess of knots and strings that seem to happen for no reason whatsoever. But from Mordecai, we can learn that God is always at work behind the scenes, weaving our lives and experiences into his master tapestry in ways that are so much higher and so much more creative than we could have ever come up with on our own. And then finally, we cannot out-bad God's good. The whole reason that the Jewish people were there in the first place was because of the exile. Remember, as a people, they had continually rejected the Lord's authority over their lives and continued to do things that broke his heart. But even in exile, he was faithful to care for them, to love them, to protect them, and to preserve his promises to them. God remains faithful even in our unfaithfulness, and he can be trusted to finish what he starts. And I've asked Donnie to come and close us out with a song because maybe you are afraid of the cost of obedience, and maybe, like me, things in your past have caused you to seek out security over God's calling. Maybe you might need to ask God to show you some things about yourself that he wants to change. Or you might be in a season of suffering and you need to know that God is working behind the scenes. And I want to give us an opportunity to maybe identify with one of those things or one of those characters and take those things before the Lord and surrender them. And then when we're all done, Andy is going to come close us out. So thank you guys very much.
Let's go ahead and stand. Here I am, I'm down on my knees again, surrendering all, surrendering all. And find me here, Lord, as you draw me near. I'm desperate for you. I'm desperate for you. And I surrender. drench my soul as mercy and grace unfold. I hunger and thirst. I hunger and thirst. With arms stretched wide, I know you hear my cry. Speak to me now. Speak to me now. And I surrender. And I surrender. And I want to know you more. I want to know you more. I surrender. And I surrender. And I want to know you more. I want to know you more. Like a rushing wind, like a rushing wind, Jesus breathe within. Lord, have your way, Lord, have your way in me. Like a mighty storm, stir within my soul. Lord, have your way, Lord, have your way in me. Like a rushing wind, Jesus breathe within. Lord, have your way, Lord, have your way in me. Like a mighty storm, stir within my soul. Lord, have your way, Lord, have your way in me. Have your way in me, Lord. Oh, have your way in me. Like a rushing wind, like a rushing wind, Jesus breathe within. Lord, have your way, Lord, have your way in me. Like a mighty storm, stir within my soul. Lord, have your way, Lord, have your way in me. And Lord, have your way, Lord, have your way in me. And I surrender. And I surrender. And I want to know you more. I want to know you more. I surrender. And I surrender. And I want to know you more. I want to know you more.
I'm going to pray to close us here in just a second. Just this message, it stood out to me first service, and I wanted to share it with this service too. You guys can sit down for just one more second. I'll just miss some prayer in just a second. But this, I thought, was a very powerful message, the way that Courtney weaved all the stories together with traumas and villains and all these things going on in life. And just this example that she brought out with the tapestry of just how God uses all of it to just create so much beauty. But one of the things that happens to us in life oftentimes is that because of what has gone on, is that we actually like to turn away from people, turn away from community, turn away from connection, turn away from the Lord. Like we turn away because we don't want everyone to see the brokenness. But when you turn away, all that people see is the brokenness. People are aware. They can see that stuff's going on. And that's all that's seen. And we think we're hiding it, but we're not. But it's actually when we turn in and we turn towards the Lord and we turn towards each other that we're actually able to see the beauty of what God's doing in people's lives. And the connection and the community that happens, not because we're great, but because we can look and go, wow, look at what God did with all of those things. There was somebody recently that I was talking to that had done a lot of self-harm and cutting. And then the Lord got a hold of their life and changed their life. And it's been a while. But since then, they've never been swimming. Because if they go swimming, people will see. And I talked to him, I said, well, what if those are not the negative that you think they are? What if those are the beautiful marks of God's grace? What if somebody sees those and asks you about those because they're going through the same thing, and then when they see that, they go, how did you stop? How did you get out of this? How did you change? And you get to point to this, the goodness and the greatness and the incredible love of God. And just recently, the first time they went out and went swimming. And we're free from that. Whatever has gone on in your life, whether you did it or someone else did it, whatever's happening. And I know Courtney, and I know some of her story, and Courtney's gone through stuff, and there's temptation to hide. And she shared just a little brief statement about I can attest to it in my own life. But to come forward and to try to bring the gift that God's given you and the purpose that God's given you and to walk in it and to do it in community and to face forward is what the enemy doesn't want you to do. But if you face forward, the goodness and the glory of God can be seen. And when we all do that, then we're all surrounded by the beautiful pictures of the work of God in each other's lives. Let's bow our heads. I just want to encourage you. Face forward, face the Lord, face each other, come into community, be vulnerable, be open, and let God's goodness be on display. Father, I pray that you be with each person today, and as we go out, Lord, to be in our week, Lord, I pray for us to have boldness and confidence, Lord, and joy, Lord, in sharing who you are, Lord, sharing, Lord, our scars, sharing our knots and our twisted things, Lord, that we can show that we've been through or that we are going through, because they all point to your great mercy and your great love and your great goodness in our lives. And so, Lord, I pray for a boldness and a joy, Lord, to come, Lord, for our testimonies. And that, God, you would receive the glory. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. All right, guys, down the hallway, they have been working on pancakes for us. So stick around, get some pancakes, have a good time, make some friends, and just be part of community today. Amen. You guys have a great week. We love you. Thanks for coming.